What is going on, guys, and welcome back to Bought to Build. Today we're going to be taking the cheapest car that we could get our hands on and building the cheapest functional turbo kit that we can put together. So right here behind me we have the $500 Civic. We picked this thing up a little while back and we put a manual swap in it as well as a Honda, and then we brought it to the dyno, automatic and standard, to see what this thing would put down NA. Now the main reason for doing this build series is a lot of time when I'm talking to people, they always say that they can't afford to build a car to have fun with. So I wanted to dedicate this whole series to having a ton of fun without a ton of money. You can pick up something like this, put together your own turbo kit, and go out and have an absolute blast. So let's get through the intro and jump right into today's video. So now that we've gotten through the intro, I want to give you guys a quick rundown on some of the parts that we're going to be using for this build. Now, I want to start right off with saying that this kit is not going to be perfect. It's not going to get every last quarter of a horsepower out of this particular combo, but it's going to be perfect for anybody that has a stock motor and is just trying to go out and have some fun. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be functional. So to start off with, we've got our eBay turbo manifold. We went with a cast one. You can get a tubular one for a similar price on eBay, but I didn't want to have to constantly be welding it up, so we went with something that I think should last a little bit better. This one is a top mount, and then it has a 38mm wastegate spot on the bottom here. Now I like this one because it all merged right around where the wastegate spot is. Some of them are on one runner, and I think that could be an issue for boost creep. So this is the manifold we went with. All of these parts, especially the major parts, I will put a link in the description below so that you guys can check them out after the video. So moving on from the manifold, we've got our main part of this kit here, which is the maxpeedingrods TO4E with the billet wheel. This seems to be a pretty nice piece for the money. I think they're right around 200 bucks if you use a discount code. So I think it's going to be perfect for our little D series here. It's not a massive turbo, but it's a pretty good looking unit. I'm very curious to see how this thing holds up and if it stands the test of time. So moving on from the turbo, we have our intercooler. Again, this is an eBay special. It is a 4-inch core. I think this is going to do the job perfectly fine for what we're doing, especially when we put this thing on E85. So moving on from the intercooler, we have got the flange. We picked this one up from DNA Motoring. This is the exhaust VBAND flange. It's going to bolt right up to our turbo and adapt it from 2.5-inch over to 3-inch with a VBAND. I wanted to go with a VBAND so that if we have the hood off and we want to turn the 90 up, we can have it shoot straight up, or we can just simply flip it around and connect it to the full 3-inch exhaust that we're going to make for this thing, so that it's still going to be daily drivable quiet if someone wanted to. So we've got the flange here. Then this box here is just a bunch of miscellaneous parts. We are going to be making all of our charge piping out of pipe that we had laying around the house. Like I said, I'm trying to keep this as budget as possible. Doesn't have to be perfect, just has to work. So we've got some stainless steel tubing that we had from the GTO project. It is 2.5-inch pipe, and we're going to be using that for all of our charge piping. Yes, aluminum would be better. If you guys want to see how to do an aluminum charge piping setup, you can go back and check out the GTO build. We did full aluminum intercooler and charge piping for that whole project. But for this one, like I said, stainless steel, just because that's what we have laying around. Then we've got another Amazon special right here, just a cheap little 38mm blow-off valve. It does have an adjustment on the top. I'm curious to see how well that actually works. We are still waiting on a wastegate. I went with the DNA Motoring wastegate from eBay. I think it's like 65 bucks. Again, we're gonna see how that thing holds up. So moving on from the blow-off valve, we have the fuel pump that we're gonna be using. This right here is a URBO 450. This came out of the Hellcat. When we switched it over to running 3 525 liter per hour pumps, and this 450 is going to be absolutely perfect for the Honda. It'll work fine for E85 or pump gas. So that's what we're going to be running for the pump, and I'm going to show you guys how we're going to do our wiring. Usually I would buy a hot wire kit from like Beachworks or something like that, but today we're just going to get a relay and a pigtail and get it wired up as cheap as possible. So that pretty much sums up the major parts of this kit. So we're going to get to work. We're going to start with the stuff that I am looking forward to the least, which would be wiring. So we're going to jump right into getting this pump installed, get the hot wire kit made, and then we can move on to the fun stuff. Alright guys, so like I said, we're going to start off with the fuel system. We've got our fuel system components out here, and we've got the back seat opened up. So we're going to go in back here. There is a 10mm bolt right there, so we're gonna have to loosen that guy up, and then we can pop out this rear bottom seat and get to the fuel tank. Lift up and pull out just like that, and the rear seat will come out, and now we have access to our fuel tank. So we're gonna get, in our case, a Phillips head screwdriver. Go ahead, zap these out, and then we will have access to the hanger so that we can get the pump out of there. But before I go breaking that loose, I'm just going to get everything disconnected from the top while it's planted and firm so that you can fight these hoses off, and we'll also get the pump itself unplugged. So let's go ahead and start getting everything disconnected. Now you need a 10mm socket to come in here and start breaking all 6 of these nuts loose. And now we can start working this cover loose. Like so. Now I like to grab a little bucket or something so when we pull this thing out we can set it right in it so you don't get gas everywhere. Alright, and now our pump is out. This is the assembly that we're going to have to mount our new pump to. So let's head over to the bench and get this thing ready. So we got that to come apart now. I'm going to steal this piece of rubber off of our factory one here. I usually don't like to use a rubber hose in the tank, especially if we're going to be running E85, but to be honest with you, I don't have one of the plastic straws that are short enough to put in the tank here. And this car's got a factory fuel filter in the engine bay anyways, so I think it's going to be fine for now. Now that we've got everything fully disassembled, we can go ahead and start wiring up our new pump. So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm just going to go ahead and cut the wires that are going to our plug for the URBO, and we're just going to tap into this. Now I know you want a heavier gauge wire for the fuel pump because it does have a lot more draw, but if it's a super short run, we're going to be fine. So I'm just going to cut this as short as we can and use our wire from the URBO, and we'll tap into it right here, run it through here, and then from here on everything will be a heavy gauge wire. So that little short run isn't going to hurt it. So let's go ahead and start getting this thing all spliced together. So we got that on, that's in. Honestly, I don't think that would go anywhere, but we'll probably throw a hose clamp on it just because. We can go ahead and throw our ground wire on. Alright guys, that's our URBO 450 installed. We can go ahead and throw this thing back in the tank. We've got the new fuel pump assembly here. We're going to feed it into the tank. Just be careful on this lip with the wiring because it can like shave the insulation off the wire. If you're not careful, it's sharp. So let's start feeding this thing into the tank. Simple as that. We can go ahead and throw the nuts back on it. Now, if you guys decide to start with a cheap car that's not a Honda, all this stuff that we're doing today is going to be very similar, if not the same. Your fuel systems might be a little different, and certain like details might be different, but all of these principles are still going to apply. More fuel, more air equals more power. So let's go ahead and start making our hot wire kit. All right, guys, so as you can see, we got this thing pretty much buttoned up back here. I didn't want to go into crazy detail on the hot wire kit because I've done a couple videos before very in-depth on that. So if you guys want to see more on the hot wire kit itself, go back on the GTO playlist. I've got the single pump hot wire kit and then the dual pump hot wire kit. The only thing we did different here was instead of actually buying a hot wire kit, I just went down and picked up a relay and pigtail. I think it was like 10 bucks total. So yellow is the power wire going to pump. Red is the power coming from battery into relay. Your blue or purple is your trigger, and the green is ground. And then you run that yellow wire directly to the hot wire for your pump. And then I took my ground wire from the pump, grounded it right here at the seatbelt bracket, and then I also grounded the relay at that seatbelt bracket. So we should be good to go there. I'm gonna go ahead and kick the key, make sure that we hear the pump kick on, and then we can move on to something else. All right, let's listen for the pump. Oh yeah, you can definitely hear it kick on. I'm gonna feel the relay. Oh yeah, it's clicking. And you can definitely hear that pump a lot louder than the stock one, but not ridiculously loud. So let's go ahead and throw this back seat back in here. So now that we've got the new fuel pump wired up, we can move out to the engine bay and start working on some of the fun stuff. So we've got the stock manifold, cat, and full exhaust still on this car. So we're gonna start working on getting that off so that we can bring the turbo and turbo manifold in, start mocking it up, and see what we're gonna have to do fitment wise. So let's get this old crusty manifold off and start working with the new stuff. We actually got super lucky. All the nuts from those studs came right off and the manifold came right off. It's actually not as crusty as I thought. So we can go ahead and set this guy aside and start grabbing our turbo parts. Well, I'm gonna throw a couple of the nuts on this thing real quick, and we will grab the turbo and see if we're gonna have any clearance issues. I'm just hoping that the hood is somewhat close to closing and that we will fit by everything else near it. So let's see. It actually drops in surprisingly well. It actually seems to fit in there really nicely. I'm still amazed with this $125 manifold from eBay that we didn't have to trim it for the power steering bracket or anything. Thing seems like it fits great. Let's take our hood light off and try closing this thing and see if it clears. I don't mind trimming it, but I'd rather have it not just partially stick out. Oh man, we got plenty of room. That thing's gonna hide right in there perfectly. Now that we know that it actually fits, let's go ahead and start ripping the front bumper off this thing, and we can start mounting the intercooler. As you guys can see, we've got the intercooler mocked up on here, used a ratchet strap. A lot of people cut this bumper support out of here or just unbolt it all together, but I don't think we're going to need to do any of that for our setup. This intercooler seems to fit pretty good right up underneath it, butted up against it. We'll make some brackets off of this, probably nuts or weld it, and then bolt right to the intercooler when the time comes. But before we do that, I want to make sure the bumper fits, so let's go ahead and grab it and test fit it. So that's about where it's going to be. The placement looks pretty decent. I like where the intercooler lands on this bottom opening, but we are hitting and there's some fins back here on the fender itself, on the bumper itself, that are hitting the intercooler. So we'll go ahead and pop this guy back off for now, and we're gonna have to do some modifications to the bumper. Not sure if you guys can see it, but there are some like extended fins for air damming, I would guess. So we'll take this over to our hood stand, set it down, get a saw out, and start cutting this stuff up until we can make it fit how we want. All right, let's see if it's gonna fit now. I think it came out looking pretty good. I like the placement of it. I was gonna cut all of these right out, but I think I'm gonna leave them for now. Kind of think it looks nice. So let's go ahead and pull the bumper back off, and we can start making the brackets for the intercooler. So you guys just seen me whip up a couple of these little Z brackets. We're gonna be using these to hold the intercooler in place, and we're gonna mount it directly to this crash bar using a nutsert tool. If you guys have never used one before, I definitely recommend picking one up. They are super handy to have in the toolbox. I've actually got a few of these, and I've got some in metric, some American, and they are so handy to have. I use them a lot for fuel line and also wiring harnesses. You can put a nutsert and then use like a nice tie down for it. But today we're going to be using it to mount into our crash bar here and get our intercooler a nice solid spot to mount. That thing is mounted. Let's get this strap out of the way and we can start moving on to the next part of the project. Now that we've got the intercooler mounted and I'm happy with its location, we went ahead and pulled the stock exhaust off and got it out of our way. And we're gonna start working on building our charge piping. I was gonna use the aluminum I have left over, but I decided I wanted to stick with the theme of this build and do something that we could MIG weld, because I know a lot of people at home might not have a TIG machine. So we decided to scrounge up some 2.5-inch mild steel and stainless steel pipe out of our scrap pile, and I went ahead and hopped on Amazon and bought a bunch of these cheap little 90-degree bends. They are stainless steel. We're gonna see how they weld, but that's what we decided to do. We can always come back through and upgrade this thing, pretty it up in the future, but I wanna show just how cheap, easy, and effective we can put this thing together. So let's start getting the turbo plumbed into the intercooler.
We've upgraded almost every component.
So we're making some progress here. We've got the pipe coming off the turbo, shoots right down there, and then it comes out, does like a little 180 bend, and then shoots into the intercooler. Come out of the intercooler right over here, go about to here, 90 back, and then you guys can see there's a little divot in this pan right here. So we're gonna take a 3-inch hole saw, drill a hole right there, come right up with the pipe and shoot it directly over to the throttle body. I think that's gonna be our best and most direct route. So let's go ahead, get some hole saws out and start drilling a hole. So as you guys have seen, we've been working on getting all of our charge piping mocked up and in place. Now, if you guys don't have access to a welder, you could totally make this work with just a bunch of silicone couplers, 90 straights and whatnot. But since we do have a welder, it is actually cheaper for me to weld up where I can. Now, I did have to cheat and run down to our local auto parts store. It was $8.99 and I picked up a 2-foot section of aluminized steel tubing. And then we've got another $20 to $30 in couplers. But we've got it ran to a point where I'm happy with. So, like I said before, guys, this thing does not have to be perfect. It just has to work. So we've got a 90 silicone reducer coming off the turbo into our straight section, where it comes down to a couple of 90s to make this bend into the intercooler, comes out the other side into another 90, where we're gonna have a silicone 90 right there so that this upper pipe is still removable, comes up through the hole that we drilled earlier, into another 90, shoots straight across, headed towards the throttle body. Now, I forgot to order a flange for our blow-off valve. I was gonna order a steel one so we could just weld it onto a solid piece right here, but I forgot. So for the first time ever, I'm actually gonna use one of these little cheater pipes that comes with the blow-off valve. So we're gonna have a silicone coupler here to connect these two, and then we're gonna have a 45 right into the throttle body. Like I said a million times already, guys, this thing does not have to be perfect. It just has to be functional. We're probably gonna paint this stuff black or something just to make it a little bit more presentable, but it's gonna do the job perfectly fine. So now that we've got it to a point where we're happy with, let's pop all this stuff off, bring it over the bench, and finish weld it. We've got our charge pipes all welded up, so now we're gonna go ahead and hit them with a couple coats of paint. We've gotten our charge piping painted, we're waiting for that to dry, we can move on to something else. So what we're going to be doing is taking the oil pan and filter off, and the reason we're going to be doing that is we need a good oil supply line going to our turbo, and we need a good oil return line coming from the turbo. So what I've got right here is an oil filter sandwich adapter plate. This one happens to be from Golden Eagle, and what this is going to allow us to do is take our stock oil filter location, take that filter off, screw it on the bottom of this, and screw this right on in the place of the factory oil filter. And that will provide us with a nice oil feed line that we can run to our turbo, and this one also has an 1/8 inch NPT port, so we could put an oil pressure gauge if we like to. So with that being said, we also need to get that oil back into the system. Now normally I would just use a little weld bung. We would take our oil pan off, drill a hole, weld it on. But keeping in the spirit of this build, I'm trying to show that you don't need all these fancy tools to get this project done. So we're going to be using a little bulkhead fitting. This one comes with a couple sealing washers, and the way this is going to work is we're going to drill a hole in our oil pan, fit this in there, and then you just tighten up the nut on the inside, and it gives us a nice -10 return line. Now I'm definitely going to be using some red Loctite on this just to make sure that the nut doesn't come loose inside our oil pan, but I'm pretty confident that this is going to work out just fine for us. So let's get the oil drained, pop the pan off, and get to work. Alright, let's let this thing drain for quite a while. Since we're going to be pulling this pan off, I'm just going to leave the drain plug out for a while and let this thing completely drip drain. We let this thing drain for quite a while. We're going to go ahead and throw the drain plug back in it so we can get under it without getting oil dripped all over us. Alright, so the first thing we're going to have to do in our case is take this little brace off. Now that we've got this brace out of the way, we can get to our oil pan bolts and start popping that off. I always leave at least a bolt, or in our case a stud, a nut. I leave at least 1 or 2 on there still, and then we make sure it's going to come free and we don't have to pry on it or anything. Alright guys, just like that, we got our pan out of here. So, I'm going to put this piece of cardboard under here so that this thing can drip. And then I'm going to come under here and take a quick look at it, just make sure everything looks good. I'm happy with everything. And then we will clean up our oil pan and start making our drain fitting. So we went ahead and popped the oil pan off. I got it all cleaned up here. But when I pulled the pan off, I did notice something kind of alarming. There was a bunch of metal or bearing material in the bottom of this pan. But I did an oil change on this thing probably 500 miles ago, and everything seemed fine. The oil that came out was fine. I always cut the oil filter open, and there was nothing alarming in there either. So I'm kind of hoping that it's just from the last engine that was in here. The guy that had this before me blew up the stock engine and then threw this JDM D15B in it. And I'm hoping that they just swapped over the oil pan for some reason and didn't clean it real well, because there was a couple bolts on the oil pan that were finger loose. Like, I literally just took them out with my fingers. So fingers crossed, that's all it is, but we're gonna keep an eye on it. I would go ahead and pull a cap off, but I can't get bearings anytime soon for this thing because it's a JDM D15B non-VTEC, so it's an oddball. So I'm not even really gonna mess with it. I did go ahead and pick up a cheap little oil pressure gauge from AutoZone just to throw on it, keep an eye on the oil pressure and see if it seems to be getting worse. But for now, we're just gonna put everything back together and run it and see what happens. Hopefully this one lasts for a little while, but if it doesn't, it is what it is. So now that we got the pan all cleaned up, let's go ahead and mark and drill our hole for the turbo oil return. So now that we got the oil pan cleaned up, we can go ahead and install our bulkhead fitting for the turbo oil return. I'm going to be using some red thread locker. Now make sure you spray the threads with some brake clean first. Thread locker cannot seal if there's oil on the threads. So I'm going to use a generous amount here, because I do not want this thing coming off in our oil pan. Now we can put our little O-rings on. Put one on. Put this through just like so. Put the other one on. Now, like I said before, I do not want this thing coming loose, so I'm going to crank it right down extremely tight. I'm happy with that, so now we can go ahead, grab our gasket, lay that on here, and get this oil pan put back on. I'm just going to run through and torque them down in sequence. Alright, now that the pan's all torqued up, we can throw our brace and cover back on and then start running lines. So now I want to go ahead and get the oil pressure gauge mounted. I've decided that I'm going to put mine right down in here. It's nice and hidden out of the way and it won't look super tacky up on the dash somewhere. So we've got to go ahead and get this piece out of our way. And now I'm just going to go ahead, pop this out with a couple screws. We'll bring it over to the bench, cut a couple holes for the line and the wiring, and get this thing mounted up. So now that we've got this adapter plate mounted up, we can go ahead and finish mounting our oil pressure gauge and start making our oil feed line going to the turbo. Just finished getting the oil pressure gauge installed. Came out pretty good for a $20 gauge. It looks decent for where it is. Got the center console back together. I ended up wiring it in so that the light kicks on when I turn on the headlights. So as you can see, it kicks on, kicks off. We'll have to keep an eye on that when we go to fire this thing up. Let's start working on the feed and return lines for the turbo. So we've switched over to start making some oil lines for this thing. We've got a 4 AN that's going to be feeding it, and then a 10 AN that's going to be returning the oil back to the pan. So we want this center section as straight up and down as possible so that oil can flow right through and then back to the pan without building up in the center section, causing any issues. So as you can see right now though, we're having an issue with it. We can't get it on a better angle than this because that bottom fitting is actually hitting the manifold. So we're gonna have to take the turbo off, the manifold off, head over to the vise and make some more room. So as you guys can see, we were able to grind enough off that manifold so that our fitting now fits in there perfectly. We've got our center section almost perfectly straight up and down, and we went ahead and played with a bunch of different fittings to see what was going to line up best for us. We ended up going with these 45s. We've got a 45 on the turbo drain and then a 45 down on the pan. Now we can take our AN hose and go ahead and start building this up, and it's going to run almost perfectly for what we want to do, a nice downward angle all the way to the pan. The only thing we are going to add to this is a nice heat sleeve so that we can try to keep from melting this rubber hose. So let's go ahead and get these fittings back off and start assembling this hose. So we're going to start throwing the hose ends on our AN line here for the turbo oil drain. I've gone over AN and PTFE lines in a previous video in depth, how to make them and some of the differences between them. So if you guys want to know exactly how to make an AN or PTFE line, make sure to go back and check that video out. But today we're just going to go ahead and get these things thrown together.
That's huge. So it's not just
boom.
A power consideration. It's really
got our hose made. So I'm pretty happy with that. It does come out a little far, but it's a steady downward motion, so I'm happy with it. Now we can work on getting a feed line made for this thing. So as you guys just seen, we finished up making all of our oil lines, so there's only a few things left before we can put this thing together for final assembly. One of those being painting the exhaust manifold. Now as you guys seen, we did a bunch of grinding on this thing just to clean it up and make it so that we could clock the turbo properly. And I think those spots that we ground on would be prone to rust. So I've got some header paint that was just chilling up on the shelf that we're going to spray this thing with to keep it nice and clean looking. There are a couple things that I'd like to do to this max speeding rod turbo before we put it on that I think would help improve the flow characteristics of it. One of them being cleaning up this compressor housing. I think I can take a bunch of meat off of there and get rid of all the casting marks going through it. And then another big one is this exhaust housing. I've got the gasket here that mates the turbo to the exhaust manifold, and it fits the exhaust manifold almost perfectly. But when you hold it up to the exhaust housing on the turbo, there is a ton of meat left there, and I think that's really going to inhibit flow. It's like the air would have to hit a brick wall before it can continue to flow. So I'm going to go in there, open that up, and taper it all off so that the air has a nice smooth transition into the exhaust housing of the turbo. But you guys are going to see all of the porting in a separate video, so let's go ahead, get the manifold painted, turbo ported, and get this thing ready for final assembly. As you guys can see, we've got the manifold painted and the turbo is ported. I'm super happy with how this thing came out. Like I said before, this will be in a separate video, so make sure to go back and check that one out because it came out super sweet. We opened this outlet right up, we got a lot of that meat out of there, and it looks really good and it's a lot smoother. All the transitions and all the casting marks all throughout the thing are way better. And then we worked on getting the exhaust housing to a point where I'd be happy with it. And as you can see, The exhaust flange for the manifold fits this thing so much better. There was a big brick wall all the way around that was going to impede airflow, and now that we got that thing all smoothened out, tapered in, I think the transition is going to be a lot smoother for the exhaust to pass over. So now that we got all that done, we're going to go ahead and flip the turbo on its side, because we did pick up a little adapter so we can bolt this right to our TO4E turbo, and it's going to adapt us over to a 3-inch VBAND, because we are going to be running a 3-inch exhaust on this car. So we went ahead and picked this up. It did not come with any bolts or a gasket, so I used some Mr. Gasket exhaust gasket material, traced one out, cut it up, and we've got that right here. So we can slap this guy on here, then we're just going to bolt this down with some of the stainless steel hardware that I picked up. Now I am going to be using some high temp anti-seize so that if we ever have to get this thing apart again, we can. So let's go ahead, grab our bolts, start putting this thing together so we can get it slapped on the car. Hopefully putting this manifold on for the last time. Got our gasket in there. Now we can just run through and snug all these down, work our way out, and then I'll come back and check them again. I completely forgot to put any kind of bead or weld here to keep the boots from popping off. And if you guys seen the GTO video, you know my little trick to this. I picked up a cheap little set of wire crimpers from Harbor Freight, and you just go through, you can cut the ends off them if you want, it makes it a little bit easier, but you can just go through just like this, clamp it, and then squeeze, and it'll make that nice little nub, and you just work yourself right around. When you're done, you end up with something like this, a nice even bead all the way around. It actually comes out pretty good for not having an expensive bead roller. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit the rest of these pipes real quick, and then we can start putting them back on the car. Now I'm just working on getting some of the charge piping installed. So I've been working on getting a bunch of the little things buttoned up. As you guys seen, we got all of our charge piping ran. I did throw an oil filter on it and hook up the oil feed and return line to the turbo, so that's all set. We are waiting on injectors, and I'd really like to start this car up before the end of the video, and I'm not sure if the injectors are going to show up in time. So I'm going to leave the factory injectors in it for now so that we can at least start it with them. So we're going to move on to working on the exhaust. Now I do have a 90 here that I TIG welded a while back for another project that we didn't end up using. So we're going to build off of this, and everything that we're going to add to it today I am going to MIG weld, just to show you guys just how doable all of this is and to keep with the theme of this build. So we've got our 90 here and a VBAND on our turbo, and we're going to build off of that so that we can go straight down with it, but also at any time take the VBANDs off and flip the tube up and come straight through the hood if we so choose. So we'll have a VBAND on each end of our bend, and then we will be able to run it straight down and then make a full exhaust for this thing later on when we want to. So let's start making some new pie cuts and get this thing fabbed up. So we've got our 90 here with a few pie cuts that I added to it, and I've got this thing pretty close to where we want it. It's a super tight fit going with 3-inch pipe between the fan, the clutch sleeve, and everything else. So I've got it shot down right through there. Now I'm gonna go ahead and start at this first one up here, and we'll start getting it tacked to this V-band and just work out from there. We still needed to get a wastegate dump made, so I went looking in our scrap pile and I found part of an old pressure washer that just happened to be stainless steel tubing. So we went ahead and cut some of that up and mocked it up, and it turned out to work perfectly for our wastegate dump. So I've got this thing mocked up, tacked up. Let's go ahead and finish weld it. You can lay a decent looking weld with a MIG welder. I prefer TIG for most of this stuff, but like I said, guys, it is totally doable with what you have. Now that we've got our downpipe made, we need somewhere that we can put a wideband gauge for tuning reasons so we can read our AFR. So I picked up a couple of cheap little O2 bungs, same thread as most common wideband gauges. Marked it on the car where I knew we were going to have room for a sensor. Now we can just pop a hole in it and get this thing welded up. Perfect. Now we can clean it up a little bit and get this thing welded on. Make sure you keep the plug in there so that when you weld it, it doesn't deform. You can use an old sensor, but most of these weld-on bungs come with a plug, so that's what we're going to use. We ended up needing some form of a vacuum block, so I just went ahead and threw this together. It's just an 1/8 inch NPTT with a 3/8 barb on this side and then some quick connect fittings on this side so that we could run our hard plastic line to the blow-off valve and to the wastegate. So we're just gonna go ahead and get this guy installed, and then we can run our lines for the blow-off valve and to the wastegate. We are finally just about ready to try to start this thing for the first time with the turbo. There's only 2 things left that we need to do. We need to throw some oil in it and put our dump pipe on. I'm gonna put the down pipe facing straight up just for now for the first start. So let's get those 2 things done so we can try to start this thing. We are good to go. Let's get set up and try to start this thing. Actually ran really good, guys. I'm super happy with it. A little bit of smoke out of the up pipe there. I'm gonna check this thing over and make sure everything else is good. So as you guys seen, this thing fired right up. I couldn't be happier. It sounds pretty cool and ran pretty decent. We didn't get to mess with the tune at all, so it was a little bit smoky, but fired up nonetheless. I do have some good news and some bad news though. Bad news is we are still waiting on the injectors and a map sensor. Map sensor should be here in a couple days, but the injectors I've been waiting a few weeks, so I'm not really sure when those are going to show up. So I started looking locally, or if someone could send me a cheap set, even a used set for now, so that we could get our boy Stoll Innovations behind the keyboard and get to tuning on this thing, because I want to take it out and test some of these budget parts that we decided to go with and make sure that everything's going to work out for us. So hopefully I can come up with something on that end, and then we can get out and do some testing with this thing. But the good news is, as you guys seen earlier in the video, we had a bunch of very fine metal in the oil pan, so I kept an eye on the oil pressure gauge when we did the first start for you guys the other day, and the next day I came out, fired it up, let it get up to operating temperature, and when it's cold it's got about 90 pounds, and then when it warms up it's got about 40, so I'm perfectly happy with that, but I will keep an eye on it. So as always, I appreciate you guys for checking out the channel. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell. And check us out on all of our other social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, and Bought to Build Official on Instagram. And we will catch you on the next one.
Oh.